Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad. I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, we are now squarely in the throes of winter, which means it is the time when stored diesel fuels are going to be facing gelling problems. Now, in earlier podcasts, we talked about why diesel fuel gels and why you should get anti-gel treatment and when you should apply that anti-gel treatment for any stored diesel fuel that you happen to have. But we are now past that point. Now we're into those cold temperatures that we talked about earlier. So, what we want to do today is we want to give some ideas of how you should be monitoring your fuel in the cold weather. And there are some questions that we can address. Questions you might be thinking yourself, but maybe weren't sure how to answer. See, even if we're well familiar with the problems that fuel gelling can cause for the engines that use our fuel, even if we're completely on board with the need to use anti-gel, that doesn't mean that we understand everything about how to use it. And it doesn't mean that we still might not have questions that we wonder about. So the first question that many people ask, that first question is one that we have talked about before in a previous episode, but it's a pretty important question. So maybe it's useful to review it again. And that question is, what should I look for in order to know when I should be prepared to put anti-gel treatment in my stored fuel? In other words, what are the signs that tell me now you should be thinking about putting that anti-gel treatment in? Now, the answer to that question all has to do with temperature, both the temperature outside and the temperature characteristics of your fuel itself. And that makes sense because gelling has everything to do with outside temperature. Inherently, we know that fact. And if you have to manage diesel fuel in cold weather, you should be paying attention really to two things. First thing is you should know what your fuel's cloud point temperature is. Some say cold filter plug point is the one that you should pay attention to, but cold filter plug point temperature is more difficult to know, and it's also something that's dependent on a factor, if you will, that's outside of the fuel itself. It's dependent on the characteristics of the filters that are used by the diesel engine. For just to give you an example, common rail diesel engines, they are pretty well the standard for all new diesel engines nowadays. Well, common rail diesel engines experience gelling problems earlier at higher temperatures than older diesel engines because common rail diesel engines use high performance filters that catch more of that wax, which means they gel faster, if you will. And that means that there's also a smaller difference between the cold filter plug point temperature for that engine and the cloud point temperature of the fuel. And that's true for common rail diesel engines more so than for those older engines. There's a smaller gap. And so, in that respect, cold filter plug point temperature is actually at least significantly dependent on the engine that's actually using that fuel. So, when you're choosing between the two, it's actually better to know what the cloud point temperature of your fuel is. Now, the cloud point's important because cloud point's the temperature where the waxes in the fuel start to appear and drop out of solution. And what's more, the longer that the outside temperature stays below the fuel's cloud point temperature, the more wax is going to appear in the fuel over time. That brings us to that number two important thing, which is it matters what the outside temperature is. You should be monitoring the outside forecasts for signs that the low temperatures in your area are expected to drop near or below your fuel's cloud point temperature. And so you're aiming to make sure that you've got your anti-gel in your fuel before that happens. Of course, when we say you should monitor it, right, you're really just looking at the forecasts. And we do have to account, let's say you're looking at the 30-day future forecast, and it's forecasted to drop to, whatever the temperature is. But you have to account for the possibility that the actual temperature could turn out to be colder than the prediction is. And so that's why we advise that you look at the long range forecast, look at the 2 week, look at the 30-day monthly temperature forecast, and then expect to account for about a 10-degree buffer for that temperature. So, in other words, when you look at the forecast and you see that the temperatures, the projected temperatures, are slated to drop to within 10 degrees of your fuel's cloud point, then that's a sign that you will want to take the steps, whatever steps you need to do to add your anti-gel to your stored fuel. Of course, in order to do that, in order to know what 10 degrees above your fuel's cloud point is, you have to go back to that first thing, that number one thing that we talked about. You have to know what your fuel's cloud point temperature is. And that can be a challenge for many people because they can't always get that information from their fuel supplier. Or maybe they have a tank of stored fuel that they've been using fuel from and adding fuel deliveries to over time over the course of the year. And so that fuel in that tank is an agglomeration, it's a mix of different fuels that have kind of been put together over a period of time. And so that could mean that in that tank, they've got both summer diesel fuel and also some winter diesel fuel all mixed together in that tank. And that matters because the typical cloud point temperature for summer diesel fuel and winter diesel fuel, they're different. The refinery that produces those fuels will usually, depending on what time of year it is, they will usually try to tweak or adjust the number two diesel fuel that they produce to maybe lower its cloud point temperature if they know the fuel is going to, any colder weather markets that tend to get fuel from the supply from that pipeline. So the winter fuel is going to have a cloud point that's at least a few degrees lower than the summer diesel fuel that's used during the warmer weather. Now, since very few users actually know their fuel's cloud point, we're left with having to make an educated guess here. And so we will use that educated guess to establish a rule of thumb that will help us answer that question. So if we look at pipeline specifications from the two big major pipelines that supply fuel to much of the north and the eastern part of the United States, you've got the Colonial Pipeline, you got the Magellan Pipeline. If you look at their specifications, we can see that the cloud point for summer diesel fuel is supposed to be around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if you look at winter, the winter diesel fuel cloud point is supposed to be around 16 or 17 degrees Fahrenheit. So about 3 to 4 degrees below that. Now, since you may not know what kind of summer winter diesel mix you actually had in your tank, and since it's really unlikely that you have 100% summer diesel or 100% winter diesel in there, the safest thing to do, again, if you're trying to establish a rule of thumb, safest thing to do is go with that higher temperature. Then go 10 degrees above that, and you've now got the rule of thumb that you can use if you want to be the safest about this. So the best answer to that first question of how do you know when you should treat your fuel with anti-gel? Best answer is if you don't know the exact cloud point of your fuel, assume that you need to add your anti-gel when you see that the temperature is projected to drop below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, 20-degree cloud point, 10 degrees above that, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the answer to question number one. Second question that people will often ask is, what is the upcoming winter, or what are the upcoming winter temperatures supposed to be like? And what areas of the country are likely to be seeing cold enough temperatures in the coming, month and a half that they should expect to have to do this? So in saying all that, what we're asking is what areas of the country are likely to see either sustained instances, or rather sustained periods, or multiple instances of low temperatures below 30 degrees. That's -1 centigrade for you metric people. And the period that we're considering is we want to look at late December and January, because that's probably going to be the period of time that you're going to be concerned with. Again, depending on when this podcast episode drops, that's the period that you're probably going to be looking at if you check the temperatures yourself. So if you were to base, or if you wanted to base your answer on the historical data to have an idea of what's historically seen in a given area, what would you do? Well, you'd probably look at what they call the 10th percentile data. And you can actually find copies of that in the specification ASTM D975. Now, the term 10th percentile means the temperature for a given region and during given month, below which the lowest 10% of the temperatures fall. Now, that explanation sounds a little complicated, so maybe we can explain it this way. Let's say that for 30 days, you took a daily temperature reading. And then after 30 days, you took those 30 readings that you had and you put them in order from highest temperature to lowest temperature, or from warmest to coldest. So the 10th percentile temperature for that time period would be temperature number 27 or 28. The 10th percentage coldest temperature, the third coldest temperature out of the 30, if you will. And the 10th percentile is going to fall somewhere below that. So the 10th percentile temperature is the temperature just above the 10% coldest temperatures for a given reason during a defined time period. Defined time period is important because it's going to be different in January versus May versus August, right? Yeah, it stands to reason. Now, historically, looking at that 10th percentile data, if you were trying to say, where in the country would you expect to see low temperatures below that benchmark of 30 degrees Fahrenheit, -1 centigrade? Historically, according to the 10th percentile data, just about everywhere in the continental United States would have at least a decent chance of being below that temperature in either December or January or both. The only exceptions to that would tend to be Southern California and most of the state of Florida. But saying that is not quite the same as saying what's likely to happen this year in, let's say, December 2023 and January 2024. Because remember, those 10th percentile temperature data, those are the temperatures you wouldn't expect to go below more than 10% of the days, but that's built from historical data over years and decades. And you can have years that are different than that. So really the best thing to do for your situation, best thing to do that is going to be to look at the forecast for your specific area of the country. Some people, when they're trying to answer this question, when can I expect to get really cold? There are some areas of the country where they may not even have to even worry about that because they know that it's going to be cold. Someone in, say, Michigan in January, they know what to expect as far as cold temperatures go. They're not really on the fence as far as will it get to freezing or will it not. They're just asking themselves, how far below freezing is it going to get? And coincidentally, when we say Michigan, when you look at someone in, say, Detroit, this year's forecast says that they're going to be looking at temperatures, a sustained period below or colder than 25 degrees Fahrenheit, starting from December 18th and then lasting all the way clear until the second week in March. So for people in Detroit, Michigan, or Buffalo or Minneapolis, this isn't really a question that they grapple with. They know that it's going to be plenty cold, and thus they know they have to use antigen. So our question for December 2023 and January 2024 is basically not, is it going to get cold in Michigan? It's basically how far south in the continental United States do you have to be before you don't have to expect freezing temperatures this winter, regardless of what the historical record says. What's the forecast predicting for those areas? Now, when you look at the United States and you ask that question, that answer actually varies a little bit depending on which time zone you're in, whether you're in the west, what we would call the West Coast time zone, the mountain time zone, the central, or we might call it the Midwest time zone, and then you have the East Coast or Eastern Standard Time. The answer is actually going to vary a little bit depending on which of those you're in. So let's look at what the upcoming forecast holds for those of us wherever we are in the continental United States. So here's the answers for the upcoming year. Start on the West Coast or the Western time zone. The answer, how far south do you have to be before you can expect temperatures below 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 6 weeks or so? That answer for the West Coast really depends on how close you are to the mountains that are located in the eastern part of that zone. Now, if you're in California, if you're close to the coast, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're in California in the what we would call the northeastern interior parts, closer to, let's say, the border with Nevada, or go a little bit further north, if you're in the eastern part of Washington, like let's say Yakima, or you're in the eastern part of Oregon, like around Baker City, if you're in that eastern part of that west time zone, then you definitely are going to hit those temperatures sometime in the next 6 weeks. Same thing also goes if you're in northern Arizona, like Flagstaff. But the most populous parts of California, which tend to be towards the coast, down in the Orange County, Southern California area, or if the more western coastal parts of Washington and Oregon, you probably won't have to worry about that. Now, move a little bit east to the mountain time zones. The mountain time zone picture is going to be completely different, and that is, of course, because of those mountains. Now, we already know that if you're in Montana or Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, they're all going to be well below freezing during the next 6 weeks. So those areas really aren't in question. The question is, what are the expected low temperatures going to be for December and January as we go further south from these states? Well, now we're basically talking about New Mexico. And for this winter, in New Mexico, you're going to have to go to perhaps the bottom 10% of that state closest to the southern border before you don't have to worry about temperatures dropping below that 30-degree threshold. So the answer for the mountain time zone is, unless you're right up against the border with Mexico, you should expect to have to treat your fuel with anti-gel sometime in the next 6 weeks if you haven't already done so. Now, move further east to the central Midwest time zone, which is basically all the states in the north-south line from North Dakota down to Texas, and then move a little bit even further east within that time zone, all that line of states from Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, down through Mississippi and Alabama. That's the central Midwest time zone. Now, I suspect that the answer for that question is that we're going to find more of the same as we found with the mountain time zone. But we've moved further east away from the influence of the mountains. So maybe that changes how far north that cutoff line is. Well, what we do see from the expected forecast through January is that cutoff line does actually shift as we move east through that central time zone. Now, in the western part of the central time zone, which is Texas and everything straight up from that, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, up and Iowa, I think North and South Dakota, that line, in that western part of the central time zone, that geographic cutoff line actually stays about the same as it does in the mountain. Because remember, Texas actually dips significantly further south than Arizona and New Mexico does. remember we said that for the mountain time zone, that line was in New Mexico, about 10%, the bottom 10% of the state of New Mexico. If you were to take that line and just run it parallel east into the into the state of Texas, where would that go? Well, that would actually make that line run through the Abilene, Dallas, Lubbock area. And just like with New Mexico, that area, they're all expected to see temperatures low enough this winter to be below that 30-degree threshold. The parts of the state north of that line, if you go south of Dallas, south of Lubbock, Abilene, um, let's say the bottom 40% or so of the state of Texas, if you're in the bottom 40%, bottom half of the state of Texas, let's say you're in Waco or Houston, it's probably not going to get cold enough for you to worry about it. So for that part of the time zone, the cutoff is north of Dallas, yes. Below Dallas, no. Now, if we go further east into the central time zone, now we're going into that line of states, which is Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, down through Mississippi and Alabama. If we're watching that line go through easterly through that time zone, what do we find? Well, we do see that the line kind of follows I-30 up through Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And so the conclusion that we can make is if you're in northern Arkansas, for example, from let's say Little Rock on up, you're probably going to hit some freezing temperatures in the next 6 weeks. But that cutoff line really goes up and then goes right along the border with Mississippi and Missouri, so that most of the state of Mississippi isn't going to get cold enough to require anti-gel. But southern Missouri on up, right? Branson, Columbia, Missouri, Springfield, and then on up. If you're basically anywhere north of the Missouri Mississippi border, you're probably going to have to worry about diesel fuel gelling because you are going to get some freezing temperatures, at least sometime through the end of January. And then if you look at Alabama and Tennessee, um, most of northern Alabama and Tennessee are going to have times where they'll get close, but not necessarily below that 30-degree threshold. So that's kind of your cutoff line there for the central time zone. Then finally, the eastern time zone. The answer for the eastern time zone is it depends on where you are in that time zone relative to what? Relative actually to the Smoky Mountains that run through East Tennessee, North Georgia, and Western North Carolina. If you're actually in those mountains, let's say you're in Asheville, right? If you're in the mountains, especially if you're close to Northeast Tennessee, then you are going to see some temperatures in the high 20s through the end of January. If you go east, if you get out of the mountains and you go east, let's say you go to the flatter parts of the eastern time zone, let's say the flatter parts of North Carolina, for example, the cutoff line seems to run horizontally through where? Through the middle of the state of North Carolina. So if you're north of, let's say, Winston-Salem or Greensboro, North Carolina, you should expect cold temperatures below 30 degrees at some point. If you're south of, let's say, Charlotte on down, Charlotte into Georgia, right? Then it looks like they are projecting temperatures to get down to the low 30s, but not really below that enough that you're within that danger threshold. So, just to quickly summarize, the question for the coming weeks is through the end of January, what parts of the country are going to get cold enough to require you to treat your diesel fuel with anti-gel? In the Western time zone, if you're in the eastern part, pretty much all of it. If you're in the western part near the coast, virtually none of it. In the mountain time zone, virtually all the areas above the area really close to the southern border, virtually all those areas up north, you will get cold enough to have fuel gelling. In the central Midwest time zone, if you're in the western part of that zone, then it's Dallas, Lubbock, Abilene. If you're north of Dallas, Texas, it's going to get cold. If you're south of Dallas, Texas, let's say you're in Houston, you probably won't have to worry about it. The eastern part of the central time zone, that Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and all those states north of it. If you're south of the Missouri Mississippi line, you probably won't have to worry about the cold. If you're north of the Missouri Mississippi line, you probably are going to experience fuel gelling. And then for the Eastern time zone, if you're in the Smoky Mountains themselves, yes, you're going to need to treat with anti-gel. If you're not in the Smoky Mountains, then if you're north of Winston-Salem, Greensboro, North Carolina, it's going to get cold. If you're south of Winston-Salem, Greensboro, North Carolina, you probably won't have to worry about it. Okay, so that's what they're expecting for the cold temperatures, the expected low temperatures for the last part of December 2023 and January 2024. Okay, the second big question that we're going to consider on this episode is, let's say you're thinking about anti-gel and you say, well, if I know that I have to treat my fuel with anti-gel, I expect to do that, right? But does the amount of time that it spends being cold affect whether I'm going to have, not whether I need to treat it, but whether I might need to re-treat it again sometime later this winter? And that's a fair question. Another way to ask that question could be, if I treat my fuel once at the start of winter, is that going to protect my fuel throughout the winter, no matter how cold it gets, how often? Okay, so the answer to that question hinges more so not on how cold is it getting, but how long the temperatures stay cold. And by staying cold, we mean how long they stay below my fuel's cloud point temperature. So the rule is you're more likely to have to retreat your fuel for cold flow if you have an extended period of temperatures below the cloud point. You're more likely to have to do it then than if you have just multiple periods where the temperature goes below that threshold and then it warms up and then goes below that threshold and then it warms up. So in other words, having 7 straight days where the temperatures are, let's say, 18 degrees, that's more problematic than going through 4 separate 2-day periods where it's 18 for 2 days and then it warms up. And then, a week later, it's 18 for 2 more days and then it warms up. And you have 4 or 5 of those periods. The sustained cold is far and away the worst thing when it comes to gelling problems in your fuel. The reason for this really has to do with how long that undissolved wax stays out in the fuel. So you can think of it this way. When the outside temperature dips below the cloud point, right, that's when the wax starts coming out of the fuel and it's floating in that fuel as crystals, making the fuel cloudy. Now, the longer the temperature stays below that cloud point, the more wax keeps coming out. While all that wax that stayed out previously hasn't had a chance to redissolve. So it's still there and it's being added to by more wax coming out of the fuel. The longer that all those wax crystals are floating around in the fuel, bumping into each other, getting bigger, getting heavier, the longer they're floating around like that, the longer that they have to cause problems associated with gelling, whether that's actually catching the fuel filter or settling out in the tanks and lines. So it does matter if you have extended periods of cold weather, because that means more time not only for the wax to come out of the fuel, but to sit around in the fuel and compound those cold weather problems. Now, second related thing to consider is, are those temperatures staying below that cloud point for a long period of time? You also should consider, are those outside temperatures dropping gradually or quickly? Because you're more likely to have more wax come out of the fuel if those temperatures drop quickly and suddenly below the cloud point than if they decrease gradually below it. So how does that work? Why do we say that? Well, when the outside temperature decreases, rapidly and it goes below that cloud point of the diesel fuel, right? The paraffin wax molecules in the fuel, they're more likely to come out of the fuel, and they come out in the form of these solid wax crystals, and they come out pretty quickly because that temperature has dropped pretty quickly. And this sudden temperature drop that you're seeing, what it does is it promotes the rapid formation of wax deposits. And those wax deposits are a big part of the problem. Those are the things that clog the fuel filters and affect the flow of diesel fuel through your system. And this kind of sudden temperature drop that we're talking about therefore makes it more likely to lead to operational issues in that cold weather. Now, take that scenario, a steep temperature drop, and contrast that with a steady, gradual drop down below that cloud point. When that temperature decreases gradually and steadily, things behave differently. The wax behaves differently. The paraffin wax from the fuel has more time under that scenario to adjust to the changing temperature condition. And so what that means from a practical standpoint is the wax crystals form more slowly and they get better dispersed within the fuel. So you still get wax crystals forming in the fuel during this, but those wax crystals are a lot less likely to cause immediate blockages or operational problems in your fuel system. So with respect to this question of whether you have the need to retreat fuel with anti-gel depending on how long it stays cold, how quickly it stays cold, both of those things influence that answer. Now, another thing to consider is when the temperatures do warm back up, and by that we mean go back up over the cloud point, how warm do those temperatures get back up to? That's a factor in all this because once the temperatures have gotten cold and then drop below the cloud point and that wax has come out into the fuel, ideally what you want is for the outside temperature then warm back up over the cloud point and stay there, because when the temperature warms back up over the cloud point, that wax will start to redissolve, maybe melt, but redissolve back into that fuel. But many of us, we live in places that have winter conditions where we might have, a few days or 3, 4 days a week, whatever, of 18 degrees. And then it does warm back up, but it warms up to, 25 degrees or 27 degrees. Now, 25 or 27 is above the typical cloud point temperature, but it's not really warm enough to quickly redissolve that wax back into the fuel. And so whatever wax doesn't redissolve, it's still staying in the fuel, still hanging around to cause gelling or operational problems. Now, if the temperatures have been really cold in your area and they've been really cold for extended periods of time, then as far as treating with anti-gel, you're going to need a similarly equivalent period of temperature above the cloud point in order for that wax to get redissolved. Now, how long of a period of warmer temperature does that have to be? Well, as with many things, that is an it depends answer. Now, in general, anytime the temperature gets back above the cloud point, those waxes can start to redissolve. That's the in general answer. But that temperature question really depends on things like how much wax actually came out of the fuel. How big did those wax crystals get? What shape are they? That all plays a factor in how quickly they'll redissolve once the temperature warms back up. And those questions really can't be answered in a way where you can predict what those answers will be beforehand, at least not with the kind of information that most of us who aren't petroleum chemists have access to. So in order to answer this question, we have to base our decisions on generalities of a sort. So the basic answer to the question, remember, the question was, can I treat the fuel just once at the beginning of winter and I'm protected the whole winter? Or should I expect to have to retreat that fuel? That's the question we were answering. The basic answer to those questions are, if you can see that you're about to have an extended sustained period of, multiple days where the temperature stays significantly below that cloud point, and better yet, if that period's preceded by the temperature dropping rapidly, right? If you have that kind of scenario where you are, then it's possible that you may need to think about retreating your fuel, even if you treated it before. So, how do you know when you'll have to retreat? Well, there's no specific rule that can predict that for your exact fuel. Maybe, therefore, that you may, depending on how much pain it would cause you if you did have an operational problem, you might want to choose to be conservative and treat your fuel a second time later in the winter if you're looking at the forecast and you see some extended periods of cold that are happen to be well below that cloud point. And so that is going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today. We will have links to the things that we talked about in the show notes. If you enjoy content like this, if you find it useful, let us know by subscribing to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast through your favorite podcast purveyor of choice. Let us also know that you like us by giving us a 4 or 5 star review. That really helps us as well, whether you get your podcast from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or any other podcast listening platform. So until next time, I am your host, Eric Bjornstad. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.